Welcome to Nerkshire, Britain's oldest and largest county, home to a rich tapestry of tales, legends and adventure. The monstrous Fleeking at Snuffin Cliffs, the mysterious Lob Nerd, Charlie Erger's Eat More Than You Can Cafe, Sorry Cakes, the famous Slotted Frig, the world's oldest inn, Cronock House, home of the late Lords Trebonic, the majestic ruins of Vero Abbey, the brooding Gryme Cathedral, the petrifying wells of Caster's Cove, and of course, the celebrated local delicacy, Nerkshire Spung. The Grotesque Menagerie by Nibrick's Times. In the ancient medieval town of Gryme, at the intestinal street end of the Runcible Gardens, was what can only be described as a zoo. We should give it its full title, though, of a zoological garden. Not that there was anything now that was particularly logical about it, even if it did fit the colloquial concept of a zoo rather adequately. It had once been a thriving and ambitious project of human endeavour, but having tumbled into neglect and disrepair, it trudged along, neither progressing nor diminishing. No one, it would seem, had the heart to close it down, so it just slowly and steadily encrusted itself into place like some fantastic and bizarre fungus. Walking toward the gardens, down Intestinal Street itself, was a man. He was tall, and his frame had once been robust and muscular, though it now sagged, dragged down by the fabric of his long coat, like the awnings and upper stories above the shambles of T'other's Lane, through which he'd just passed. Like them, his slump was born more of indifference than from any other reason. He wore a cap that bore an outdated official air. It had a scuffed, once shiny peak, and some braiding above it, though that had long since lost its lustre. As he drew level with his destination, he paused and wearily cast his eyes above. The man surveyed the industrially wrought iron gates and the tight and claustrophobic turn of the century turnstile above which was bolted an immense wooden sign, carved and painted in the ornate Clumbertic style of more than a century ago. His lips shaped the words, as if in an attempt to remind himself of some nobility in the original reason for the place's existence. He smiled an ironic smile and hitched up his fussy little moustache. "Ah, nobility," he said to himself, so that no one could hear. It was a member of the nobility that had created this place and then abandoned it. Had he had any saliva in his mouth, he would have spat. Oh, the story of why the 34th Lord Trebonic's cousin Everard abandoned the place is well known now, though it had been a searing scandal at the time. By modern morals, however, it was little more than a doleful tale, whose lonely and bereft characters deserved pity rather than scorn and admonishment. Still, he had his charges and his duty towards them, so, inserting the old iron key that allowed him to pass through the turnstile without parting himself from a coin, he made his way through the bars and into the dense entanglement of foliage beyond. Unbeknown to him, he'd been watched from over the road by a girl. His demeanour, that and his outmoded clothes, had caught her eye, prompting her to flick through its rather unusual filing system and come up with a little imaginary card upon which was inscribed the reason why all this had come to her attention. She drew in a long breath, and on the exhale allowed her shoulders to fall. If she didn't do it, nobody would. A swift hop across the road and the girl's coin clanked into the empty hopper. She pushed through the heavy iron barrier with her midriff. It turned with a rumble, ending its trip with one loud click in a surprisingly smooth, light action for such a heavy and ancient piece of work. Two children and their mother, having crossed over through the carriages, carts and cycles at the same time, stopped and watched her go in. Sensing this, the girl turned around and reassured them with a distinctive smile. The narrow, slightly prominent teeth and familiar easy grin were enough to identify the girl's heritage, and at this the lady relaxed, smiled back, and quickly ushered her two youngsters onwards. Pushing her purse back into her ample shoulder bag, the girl made her way down the pathway that had been roughly driven through the bushes and trees. She caught her toe slightly on one of the raised flags that had been dislodged by some sort of gnarled root. It tripped her memory back to the last time that she'd stood on this path. Unlike now, in the colourless gloom of the dank undergrowth, the sun had shone in a cloudless sky, and she'd run excitedly from the turnstile over the slate flags and cobbles towards the great fountain in the centre of the courtyard. She remembered her father calling her name and turning to his fresh, beaming smile and outstretched arms as he caught up with her and lifted her up so that she could run her hands into the constantly flowing water and stroke the shimmering ocella filatants as they flowed gracefully by, basking in the summer sun. The fountain, of course, was still there and flowing, fed from the aqueduct that brought the water from the high wolds down to the town of Gryme. It was now partly overgrown, the approaching vegetation threatening to dismember its masonry with ever-searching vine and root. It seemed colourless and sad, waiting for its own demise. Life, however ugly to the human eye, persisted, even here, and she noticed it slowly expanding or idling around the bottom and clinging stubbornly, in some cases desperately, to the edges. The man she'd been following had walked this path, having made his way past the great fountain and through the main exhibition hall doors. Ivy now dominated the buildings, along with some unkempt clematis and some other tendrilled creepers that she couldn't quite put a name to. Many of the windows were boarded over, broken, the moss-pitted shapes and shards of glass lying on the whole unswept where wind and rage had scattered them. The girl followed the well-trodden path around to the main doors and gave one a tentative push. She was expecting a groan or a creak. However, it surprised her and swung open as silently and readily as the mechanism of the old turnstile. The vast reception room with its ornate statues and glass cases echoed only the silence. The carpets had frayed and rotted where they lay, and one or two of the paintings had fallen to the floor. They stood propped up against the wall below where they'd once hung, all except one. The larger-than-life portrait of the Honourable Sir Everard Cooksparrow, the founder and patron of this venture, was missing. Its mark had been left, of course, outlined by a spatter of dust and grime, but the frame and its contents were nowhere to be seen. She remembered her father, all sharp suit and smart fedora, taking her hand and pointing up to it, explaining that the benevolent and smiling man in the portrait, upon whom the rays of the sun slanted, was her cousin thrice removed, or some such thing which she'd barely understood at the time, though she understood all too well now. She had expected it to be there. It was an important work, and to find it missing, even in the midst of such dereliction, was just a little disturbing. A loud scraping noise made her turn her head. Whatever it was had come from the far end of the main hall, possibly upstairs, as a Carolingian balcony led around the upper reaches of the entire room. She turned her attention away from the missing painting and walked slowly toward the open doorway that led into one of the many display rooms. All was just as she'd remembered it. Down the middle of the hall, which must have been well over 100 yards long, stood 7 huge glass cases. In them were the remains of creatures, species long dead and species that still lived. Bones mostly, but sometimes shells and skins and faded illustrations and reconstructions of how the animals would have looked in life. Then there was the last case. In it was something that, as a child, had truly scared her. Drawing in a breath, she approached it with dread. Not as a timid child, but as an adult. As she moved in front of its case, eyes wide open, knowing exactly what it was she was going to see, it was all she could do to stop herself from crying out. She raised her hand to her mouth and gasped. She felt as if she were about to vomit. Her saliva glands had activated, and she'd begun to sweat and pant. Not only did it appear far worse to her than it had as a child, it had also moved. It would have been easier on her to imagine that the passage of time had caused it to deteriorate and slump. But that's not what this was about. The thing had visibly aged. Its movement was cellular and not gravitational. She forced herself to look at it. Without this, there would have been no zoological gardens to begin with, and the world would not be the place that it is now. Perhaps, she mused, that would not have been such a bad thing. She pulled herself together as she realized that there were a small group of people opposite on the balcony. They were looking down solemnly at the glass roof of the case. They must have come in a good 15 minutes earlier than she had to have got round that far. She must, she told herself, remember the present. She'd come in after him, not after this, or whoever was up on the balcony, and it was to him whom she must speak. So, gathering what she could of her wits, and pulling herself away from the compulsive horror, she spent the next 10 minutes or so moving slowly through the place. It was arranged to channel the visitor on a self-guided tour. Of course, when she'd been younger, there had been staff, guides who took groups of visitors round, explaining the exhibits and the procedures to them. Now, however, the visitor was alone, moving through the rooms and aisles without aid. The second gallery she remembered too. It was filled with smaller creatures, taxidermically reconstructed on the whole, and a very good job had been made of it. She moved a little more quickly now, not finding it necessary to stare at the mortal remains of reasonably familiar fauna. The third and fourth galleries held much the same thing, but of reptiles and birds. And then the fifth. Now that held spectacular fossils. Immense and ancient, they dominated the vast expanse of air under the glass dome of the fifth chamber, but none so much as the central exhibit, the colossal skeleton of an early Paleogene Draconis occidentalis, a western dragon. Its wingspan alone at full stretch would have reached 15 or more yards, and its enormous sawtooth skull, reminiscent of, though more substantial than Archaeopteryx, grinned down upon the visitor in anticipation. As far as she knew, apart from assorted and contentious fragments, it was the only one that had ever been discovered, and, as the plaque beneath it boasted, 79% complete. It was surrounded by more sets of petrified bones, diminishing in size, but not in spectacle. The room also held what was, without doubt, far and away the most important fossil ever discovered. Her attention, however, was dislodged from once more casting her eyes over such a momentous find by the sight of the man that she'd followed. She'd caught movement out of the corner of her vision through one of the huge lead-latticed windows. He was heading in the direction of the largest tropical terrarium. She must, she realized, now pick up her pace. There was a huge pair of ornate glass doors, she remembered, that opened out to the lawns at the back, where the hothouses were. But to get to them she'd need to pass through 4 more galleries. The lawn at the rear of the building, the outdoor lunch area, was neatly trimmed and still outfitted with its wooden pagodas, awnings and shelters that could be shuffled and adjusted in accordance with the weather. She made her way across, down the gravel paths and into Terrarium 1, as the cast-iron railway-style sign above the door signified. There was a sound in here, almost a hum. dripping too, as the atmosphere within had to be kept humid. The smell here was dank with compost, but fresh, and there were row upon row of carnivorous plants, seedlings for want of a better phrase, waiting to be planted out into the naturescapes of the world's greatest hothouses, or shipped out to private collectors around the globe. Cautiously she moved forward between the benches, toward a central font, and then she stopped. Something, she realised, was watching her. "Hello?" she said to whoever was listening. "Is anybody there?" The question was met with an unusual gurgling sound, as if someone was drowning, yet with no real sense of panic. She moved forward a few more steps. Then, fixing her eyes on a gap between some pots containing young Springer's constrictor plants and Flensing Bone's hummingbird traps, she recoiled and screamed. It was a sharp, involuntary response, of which she felt immediately embarrassed. Had she been able to keep a hold on herself, she'd have swallowed the reaction down. She had, after all, more or less mastered her fear of case number 7. What she saw here was horrible, but immobile. "Who's that? What's going on here?" bellowed a voice, its source unseen for the moment. "It's all right," said the girl with as much composure as she could muster. "Get out!" called the voice. "Get out! This is private property. You're trespassing. You're not allowed to—" Here his voice trailed off. He had emerged from behind a door marked "Private," off to the right of the massive stone font. In his hand was a pair of heavy secateurs, which he proffered blindly to whoever it was that was at large in his realm. He did not, however, expect to come face to face with bloodkin of Sir Everrude. Almost apologetically he lowered his weapon, though not without some hesitation. This was, after all, a lady, and he a gentleman. He allowed his eyes to drop momentarily to the floor before placing his snips on the corner of one of the tables and regrouping his demands into requests. "With all due respect," he began, "this is a restricted area. I must ask you to leave and—" Here he hesitated briefly. "I trust your discretion is assured regarding the—" Here he paused again and flicked his glance towards the table. Her scream had been more than enough to assure him what she'd seen. "I hardly think my discretion is applicable in these circumstances," she said rather prickishly, flicking her eyes back to the creature. It was, she now realised, perfectly harmless and more or less immobile, and she had recovered her composure quite admirably. First and foremost, she was a Trebonic, daughter and sister to the 36th and 37th Lord Protector, and that, in this part of the world, meant authority, total authority, and composure. The man almost blushed, and his eyes once more found their way nervously to the floor. "I don't mean to be rude, miss," he faltered. "Ma'am," the girl corrected swiftly. "I have passed my 15th year." The girl was perhaps slightly undersized and a little young-looking for her age, though that was a facet of this particular family's appearance, despite their often gargantuan appetites. I beg your pardon, ma'am," he recovered. I didn't know. Time has passed." "Indeed it has," she completed the sentence for him, but not with the words he would have chosen. "This is what I've come to speak to you about," she said. The man froze, his downcast eyes creeping up from the floor to tentatively meet hers. It was something he did not want to face. Indeed, it was an elephant in the room that he had spent quite some time deliberately ignoring. "But first," she said, "I'd like to take a tour of the Institute. A guided tour. It's a long time since I was last here, and I would like to know exactly what's new." "Yes," she mused, "new. I saw you pass through the turnstile and followed you in. Who better to give me a tour than yourself, I thought. You do remember me, don't you? I remember you well. My father once introduced us." Yes. Who could forget the daughter of Lord Burnick? He said, correcting his original tack. The girl inclined her head forward and looked at him knowingly, assuming correct interpretation of his withdrawn phrase. My father, she pointed out, was never late. But I see that we occupy the same wavelength of understanding in regard to the present situation. My name, if you've forgotten, is Bitmoria. I am quite happy to be addressed as Lady Bitmoria, she said, relieving the curator of the burden of formality. Victorious Nux, he returned, Chief Scientist and Curator of the Everwood Institute. Well then, Colonel Nux, she continued, we must begin. We will start, I think, with a description of exactly what this is. She gestured to the creature that sat in the soil between the carnivorous foliage. Although Nux had felt a flush of pride at her recollection of his once exalted rank, he also understood it to be a reminder of the depth of his descent. He was, for a moment, lost for words. He looked almost helplessly in the direction of her open hand, then at the glum, bald and bulbous creature to which it led. Its skin and pallor were akin to that of fresh putty, and it had whites to its eyes and blue irises that afforded its wandering vision a startlingly human look. It sat inert on the table, surrounded by the scattered soil, and, despite its imbecilic expression that led the casual observer to believing that it was smiling, lent gloom to the already sad and dismal atmosphere of the place. It looks like it's been shot out of a mushroom, said Lady Bitmoria tartly. Cranky Bitty, yes, thought Nux. That's what they called her. Oh, behind her back, of course. You would never offer insult or condescension to a Trebonic, even in jest, even to one 50 years your junior. Nux cleared his throat. It is, we believe, immortal, he announced, coughing nervously into his fist. Such a statement should have been accompanied with magnanimous pride, but, in the light of what stood before him, it was said almost with shame and pity. It cannot, barring physical intervention, die. Of course, it needs sustenance, the right environment in which to live, and so on, but given that its cells do not deteriorate and degenerate like those of any other creature, it has the potential to live forever. Is it intelligent? Said Lady Bitmoria. Oh no, it can barely function of its own. We believe that it doesn't even have an awareness of its needs, never mind its own existence. You must think of it as a stepping stone, Lady Bitmoria, a stage on the journey to immortality and higher beings. Higher? She replied with disgust. You haven't even told me what it is, Colonel Nux, she reminded him. I know now what it's capable of, but what exactly is it? Where did it come from? This was the question that Nux did not want to answer. To a Trebonic, however, he was compelled. It was created from the remains of an undersea prisoner. Remains, she said. He was brain dead, said Nux with justification and just a touch of exasperation. One that tried to escape. His remains were recovered with the central nervous system still viable, but with cerebral deterioration to the point where recovery of his being would have been impossible. What you see here is just life, said Lady Bitmoria. She had turned her head away from it. It may well have been mush that barely functioned, but it was still life. He knew it, and so did she. What else have you done here? She said, her tone now turning accusative. Nux's shoulders dropped. Follow me, he said, resigned to what must pass. Many of the living exhibits were well known. They'd been on display for years. The initial aim of the facility, as well as being a zoological garden, was to research the potential and capability of manufacturing and creating diversity of life. Great inroads had been made, and its moral compass had been opposed by few. Even the church had capitulated, when it had been quietly reminded of what it could stand to gain. With such discoveries as had been made early on, the ability to feed the world at will, to create tailor-made creatures and plants to supply industry with its demands and to evolve totally new ecosystems, the place was viewed as a minor miracle. He led her out past the trickling font and through the door at the end that joined Terrarium 1 onto Terrarium 2. Like the carriages of a train, all 9 of them were joined by short, glazed passageways, and they curved away round the back of the main buildings and led into the forecourts where the outdoor exhibits were housed and stabled. "You'll remember these," he said, standing aside so that Lady Bitmoria could enter Terrarium 2 ahead of him. "Ah, yes," she said. "Silkatons." They were a hybrid of plant and animal, silkworm and cotton plant, that produced balls of silk as easy to harvest and process as cotton, easy to care for, but temperamental of environment. Their thick, segmented stems swayed in the heat. The syntheses of their genetic program had been easier to achieve than had first been thought, but, try as they might, a more hardy version had not been producible. Still, they grew well in the same environment as cotton did, and assorted versions festooned the place, some naturally coloured, though much smaller and less vibrant looking than their white relatives. The next 2 houses contained the same theme, plant or plant-animal hybrids that produced useful needs. Along with the Silkatons, the most successful of these were the Funcarinhos, a complex arrangement of molecules that produced a strange, meat-bearing fungus with the translucent appearance of a flayed flat toadstool. It had been enough to alleviate hunger in 2/3 of the world, though it didn't grow in dry environments. It also pulsated, breathing in a most unsettling way. Lady Bitmoria knew it well, as it was one of her favourite dishes. It had a flavour somewhat between pork and mushrooms, slightly truffly. "You'll not have seen these, Lady Bitmoria," said Nux, gesturing towards a tank filled with a bluish-hued fluid. "There are tadpoles that reproduce asexually by binary fission. The adult frog, which is sterile, is no longer needed in the process. The drawback is that they need to be kept in this particular fluid. We are working, of course, on keeping them in water. There will be an inexhaustible tropical food source when they're perfected," he said. "They do grow into frogs, I take it," said Lady Bitmoria. "Oh, yes, but not just frogs," said Nux, regaining a little pride in his work. "Come," he said, "come and see." The next room contained a floor-wide pond, studded with stepping stones and small islands. In it, amid the saline tang of marine water, sat a number of frogs. Gigantic frogs, each one the size of a large pig. Lily pads surrounded them, and Lady Bitmoria swatted away giant mosquitoes as she made her way across the water. She was, unusually for her day, the kind of girl that wore low heels to her black leather boots, wide and not much more than an inch in height, which made it easier for her to progress. Fashionable boys wore higher, and most girls of her age would not have even been seen dead in a heel lower than 3 inches. "Don't worry," said Nux, swatting at his own sparrow-sized bug. "They are sterile and carry no disease." One of the frogs croaked. It was deafening, like a great amplified belly belch that rippled the surface and made her jump. "Each frog," said Nux, "yields 100 pounds of pure lean meat in their legs. And the beauty of it is, you see, is that these frogs, like some amphibians, regrow their limbs from bud to full length in 3 months. Each frog can produce nearly 2,000 pounds of meat in a year. And they all live for 70 years if they're properly cared for." "You're telling me," said Lady Bitmoria, "that these frogs can look forward to nothing but a lifetime of amputations and regrowths just to feed humans? Humans for which, with what has already been discovered or created, can already be fed. Nux did not like his research and his ideas being challenged. To him, there seemed to be nothing wrong with making a meal of dumb creatures. At one time they were fashionable as pets. As you may know, in this part of the world there was a distaste for eating them. However, in hungrier parts of the globe, they've been a great success. They're a delicacy that fetches a pretty price in the far west. Lady Bitmoria said nothing. She simply looked briefly around and began moving towards the next terrarium. Perhaps to her relief, it was empty, as were the remaining two, used now for storage for assorted hardware. The last door led them outside into the rear of the courtyard to the side of the main hall. Vast cages rose up in front of her, containing what looked like goats. However, their heads were much more horse-like, and they walked on two hind legs. Wings which took place of their front legs were folded against their body, which were covered in downy feathers rather than hair. A small man wearing a large turban could be seen inside, muckraking with a fork. "Like mountains," she said, and turned to Nux. He looked at her quizzically. "Like people climb mountains. You've achieved much of this not because it needed to be done, but because you could do it. You've used life as stepping stones, disposable vehicles, in order to advance the human cause, with no real thought to the welfare or the quality of the life that you've created." Nux knew it, but as a man of his times he accepted it. "Did natural selection fare any better?" he asked, although it was not his place to do so. "All species become extinct, Lady Bitmoria, whether we take responsibility for their creation and their habitat or not. Those things we cannot change." "I trust the Tigrichiroptera are secure?" asked Lady Bitmoria, ignoring Nux's last comment. They had been one of the most disastrous creations of the place, especially since they had escaped into the wild forests of northern Australia. Nature itself had begun to evolve them now, and they had become even more lethal than they had been in captivity. Nux nodded. "We only have two left," he said. "Would you care to—" he began, but was immediately cut short. "I would not," said Lady Bitmoria. "I would, however, like to see the painting of Sir Everrood." The request confirmed what Nux had feared. He sighed. "Follow me," he said. The painting stood at the rear of Terrarium 1 in Nux's office. Like so many of the others, it stood on the floor, propped against the wall, though it was, at over 8 feet tall, much larger. It was covered by a faded tarpaulin. "I trust, Lady Bitmoria, you're aware of what lies on the other side," said Nux. "As much as anyone else is," she replied. Nux pulled back the tarpaulin to reveal what lay hidden beneath. It was as she'd remembered it, the larger-than-life figure of her great-grandfather, Lord Bertibald Gransmore's maternal first cousin, the Honourable Sir Everrood Winglass Hawkingham Cooksparrow. The painting had suffered some sort of terrible trauma in the past, as a large double gash in the shape of a crooked capital letter T had been reasonably neatly stitched up with what looked like a fishing line. "I think Shabby Jazz made a reasonable job in the circumstance, don't you?" said Nux, studying the repair. "Ah, I remember," said Lady Bitmoria, smiling and turning to face him. "He was in charge of the mammoth enclosure when I was small, and the elephants. He used to organise rides. He was tending to the Panguelequians outside, wasn't he?" "Yes, Lady Bitmoria, the Sikh gentleman," said Nux. He seemed genuinely pleased that she'd remembered. "Then I think it's only fair that he unpicks his own work," she replied. Nux nodded. It had been Shabby Jazz who had insisted that the painting be repaired. The Sikh entered the room solemnly and kissed the hand of Lady Bitmoria. As with all of his people, his manners were impeccable. He set to work quickly, and soon had every one of the 3,000 neat little stitches unmade. "I am painting over with varnish for sealing the breaks, ma'am," he said, after finishing his work. "The cuts will have to be reopened again." "Then you must go ahead and open them," she said. He nodded dutifully, and taking a small knife from his pocket, he ripped open the old slashes. At first, brilliant light shone through them, awakening some colour in their drab surroundings, but only briefly. Like the effervescence from a shaken pop bottle, it gradually settled into little more than a mellow glow. "We must take it outside," said Lady Bitmoria. Nux and Shabby Jazz carefully manhandled the painting through the rear door of Nux's office and leaned it on its side against 2 pitchforks that had been planted into the ground. The breeze flapped the paint-stiffened canvas where Nux had once slashed it through with his old cavalry sabre. On the other side, vibrant colour could be seen. The sky was a watercolour blue and the grass a vibrant emerald green. Sounds, too, could be heard. Children playing and laughing. Music played on the brass instruments, and the sounds of birds and animals and water splashing. "You must be brave," said Lady Bitmoria to Nux. A tear had rolled down his cheek, and he had wiped it away quickly before she saw. She did not, however, need to see. "It comes to us all, gentlemen," she said, "though to some it comes much later than it should. It's time to step through the frame and accept the fact that we no longer be. Like myself, you gentlemen had no time to prepare yourself for death when it came. If you were anything like me, I guess you didn't even realize that you're no longer alive until you couldn't make people see or hear you anymore." "I had my suspicions, ma'am," said Shabby Jazz. "It was I who tried to convince Mr. Nux, but he refused to believe me. He kept telling me I was losing my mind, until the painting fell from the wall. It tore, and through it you could see what you see today. In fury, he took his old sword and slashed it, as you see here. I told him time and time again that we needed to step through it to be in the time that we should be in, the time in which our being had expired. But he would not accept and make me repair the painting. It has been in his office ever since." "Then you shall go first, Shabby Jazz," said Lady Bitmoria. He had a peaceful look on his face as he stepped through the rent in the picture. Lady Bitmoria and Nux saw no more of him as he stepped into the place in which he should be. Like diving into an opaque pond, he simply vanished. Nux had a pleading look on his face as he turned to Lady Bitmoria. "You may hold my hand," she said kindly, "and as the gentleman you are, you will lead this particular way." He smiled. "Thank you," he said, simply removing his cap. "I would know one thing, Lady Bitmoria, before we go," he said. "How did this painting come into being, and why is it this artifact which allows us to—" Lady Bitmoria smiled. "The painting, as you know, was commissioned by my grandfather, Lord Beninick. What you do not know is that it was created by Lady Esolfia, and it was created for the purpose for which we now stand before it. Ask no more," she said, as another question framed itself beneath Nux's ample moustache. "It is time. We must leave this world and this mode of creation behind and step into our rightful place." Nux dropped his eyes as she held out her hand. His thick, calloused hand closed around the lace-gloved fingers of Lady Bitmoria. Privilege indeed. Few ever got so close to a Trebonic. He stepped forward and thrust his hand into the gap in the canvas. He paused and waited for a sensation, though he felt nothing. Lady Bitmoria urged him on, and, taking a deep breath, he slid his whole body through, pulling her hand behind him. The world felt warm again once more for Lady Bitmoria Trebonic as she stood on the lawns of the Everwood Institute. Its common name, of course, these days, was the Grotesque Menagerie, as it played host not only to current species and the bones and pelts of archaic life, but to what remained of the weird and wonderful hybrids that had been created in a time gone by. She felt the wind on her cheeks and winced at the brightness of the summer sun. "You have done well, my dear," said a voice behind her, "and you have aged well too." "I don't really want to see," said Lady Bitmoria to the small woman in front of whom she stood. The step through the frame had aged the girl over 70 years. Nux and Shabby Jazz, of course, had simply gone to their rest. "Your rest will come with your sleep this evening, dear Bitty," said Lady Asolphia. She looked scarcely older than when she'd last seen her over 75 years ago, shortly after she drowned off the Screeland beach. Two men in zookeepers' coats arrived and loaded the painting onto the trolley. Lady Bitmoria turned to look at it. Her mouth opened in surprise. "You did not know that you were on the other side?" said Lady Asolphia. "That's what scared Nux for all those years, my dear. He'd observed you aging. It was that he had slashed at with his sabre, not Everwood. Oh, my dear, even though you thought he slashed out in rage at Everwood for his creation of the Tigrichiroptera, the creatures that had eaten both him and Shabby Jazz. Well, I'm sorry, but it was the only way that I could get you into their world. Ever since he'd figured it out, Nux, of course, had been working on immortality. He'd found a way of stepping through that painting and preserving his carnal self, not to mention whatever else it was he'd been working on. But that had to be stopped. Everything has its time and place, and we thank you for your efforts." Lady Bitmoria smiled. She paused as she watched Mammoth giving rides to the children, just as she had had rides all those years ago. "You're most welcome," she said, recovering her composure. She was, after all, a Trebonic.